Welcome to the Metagov seminar. I'm Nathan Schneider at the University of Colorado Boulder and Metagov itself. This is a really a new kind of seminar that we're running today. We're trying a new format, and it's an attempt to take a dialogue that I've been having in my head, and many of us have been having in our heads in states in the United States right now, where this idea of statewide ranked choice voting is on the ballot this coming election, and bring it into a social space and bring it into a shared conversation. We're going to hold a debate. We have two leading experts on ranked choice voting who are going to argue pro and con on the particulars of the proposals being advanced right now. We're not here to debate the merits in the abstract of ranked choice voting. We're here to talk about what's on the table as a case study, knowing, of course, that the Metagov community and the people who may watch this are not necessarily in states where this is being decided or in the United States at all. So we're treating this as a case study in governance design, but one that's very focused on, what is on the table right now, what is being voted upon, and what kinds of calculations go into the question of whether to adopt certain kinds of ranked choice voting as part of an electoral process on the scale of a state. So we have, as I said, two really eminent speakers who will be arguing for and against. On the pro side, we have Rob Richie, the founder and senior advisor of FairVote, who has been advocating for ranked choice voting nationwide. And on the con side, Lee Drutman, a senior fellow at New America, who has been an advocate of ranked choice voting, but has changed his position on it and written really eloquently about why. Both of them have been informing my thinking along with others, and this question, which initially seemed kind of clear to me, has just gotten more interesting and more complex the more I've looked into it. So I really appreciate the chance to hear this debate and to learn from it. The way we're going to proceed is we're going to have a kind of semi-formal debate process. So we'll have 10 minutes of opening statements from each speaker and then 5 minutes for a response from each speaker. And I'll keep time pretty rigorously. And then we should have plenty of time at the end for discussion with those of you who are here. Again, we're recording and we'll be sharing this publicly as usual, so just be aware of that. As we go, you can feel free to put questions in the chat, or just note in the chat that you have a question. But it would be great to see a sense of what your question is, and then I can pull you in to speak it verbally if you like, or I can read it. So please, as we go, feel free to put questions as they come up, and at the end we'll facilitate the discussion. So we will begin with Rob Richie. Are you ready, Rob?
I'm ready.
All right, take it
I
away.
haven't timed myself, so I'll try to do it well, but we'll see. So, shall we go?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, great to be able to do this. Thanks for putting it together. And I'm a big fan of so much of what Lee has brought to this space, and I look forward to seeing where we might find some common ground, even where you're going to hear some differences today, and seeing people like Mika, who I've known for 30 years. So my experience over the decades of working for ranked choice voting has been that the more voters learn about it, the more they support it, but people often have a lot of questions, and that's what we can get into today. My role is to make the case of voting yes on all 5 states, counting DC, where they're voting to adopt ranked choice voting this coming week, and to vote, I would say, vote no in the effort to repeal it in Alaska and an effort in Missouri to ban it, really dog whistle kind of thing. And I'm going to start by just saying that I think ranked choice voting, as a general matter, makes elections better. How it's played, how it's used matters and is not the same. But let me just sort of talk about the general principles. So the basic point is that it makes more votes count. I was sort of looking over some numbers. In all ranked choice voting elections, including those that don't go to a second round. 17% more voters end up voting in the decisive choice between the top two candidates. When you only look at the races where that does go to a second or subsequent round, it's more than 30% more votes count. That's a lot. And that's a lot more than you can imagine with really almost any other change that we might do for things to boost turnout or meaningful votes. And it does it in a ballot design that actually is very easy for voters. There's some dispute over that, but I think it is not difficult, and we'll get into some numbers. But when you think about what it's doing, is it's saying voters, hey, you have rather than just one vote, you have backup choices, and those are kind of the insurance policy for your vote. And a lot of voters want to do it in elections that matter to them. How many voters make mistakes? There's some back and forth about this. There's ways of spinning the numbers, but here's the basic thing. FairVote looked at all 500 plus ranked choice voting elections where we had overvote data going back 20 years in the United States. The average overvote in races that there were at least three candidates was 0.15%. That's over 99.8% were valid in the first round. Let's kind of compare that to other things that can be pro-voter. Vote by mail. A lot of people think vote by mail. Colorado has vote by mail. In the 2016 election, 4% of voters who were trying to vote by mail in the presidential election, according to an MIT study, didn't get their vote counting. We can make it better. I'm sure we have made it better since 2016, but that's a lot more than, 0.15%. You can cut the numbers. Maybe it's 0.3%, but whatever. It's a small number. In exchange for all those votes counting. Here's also some basic things that ranked choice voting does. If you're having a third-party candidate in a presidential race, like my first year working at FairVote, Ross Perot running in 92, and 49 states weren't one with a majority, or Ralph Nader in Florida in 2000, or the controversies over the minor candidates in the ballot this year, it really does address that very helpfully. Not completely, not perfectly, but very well. And it's something that offers those voters a backup choice. In crowded primaries, which we see when we have open seats quite often, and the party that's likely to win gets a lot of people running, or the presidential races, it really has this nice unifying effect. When people win in ranked choice voting elections in that kind of environment, you typically see winners getting ranked first, second, or third by like 70% of voters on average. And really quite basically, it encourages candidates to engage with more voters to learn about more candidates. You really see that happening. I live in a city with it, and it happens. And I think that's great. Turning to the ballots, let's skip over some other things. So we have two groupings of ballot measures. Washington, D.C. and Oregon are not changing to all candidate primaries. So you, in Oregon, put on the ballot by the legislature, it would add ranked choice voting to the primaries and separately to the general election for all their statewide offices, including president and governor, and for the congressional offices. So these are elections that are pretty prominent, often don't have more than two candidates running when an incumbent's running in a primary or something, but it affects open seat primaries quite often, and the occasional third party and independent candidate that can really be making a difference. I think it's a very sort of straightforward change in Oregon. It also has fusion voting, by the way, in Oregon, not the disaggregated form, but aggregated. And I think for those who are fans of fusion, which I am a fan of fusion in the aggregated form, I think it's a really cool part of what could emerge from Oregon. DC is the same, couple differences. It would also open primaries. So in the way that unaffiliated voters could vote in a party primary of their choice, which is a very common practice around the country. Probably the biggest impact is on people who are automatically registered to vote, like young people who get registered as unaffiliated and they can't vote in a primary if they don't get to change their ballot. But it affects a pretty small number of people. In their at-large races for council, there's 2 seats up every 2 years. It would actually be a semi-proportional form of RCV, where you wouldn't need 50% to win both seats, which is kind of an interesting part of it. So those are those 2 measures. Then you have 3 states trying to do the Alaska model of ranked choice voting. So this is the model where everyone, like the California ballot, the Washington ballot, some of the Nebraska, Louisiana, we see some places doing this, where all the candidates are together in the primary. So you really can call it a preliminary because it's a winnowing function. They run with party labels. You can add into that something that I strongly support, parties being able to show their nominations on that primary ballot, but that's not necessarily going to be part of any of these votes, though it could be added. So that's Nevada, Colorado, Idaho. Really interesting effort in Idaho, very grassroots effort. And then you winnow the field to 4 rather than say in California, where they do it to 2. This sort of expands what the general election electorate sees. It makes the primary less important and makes the general election, in contrast, more important. And then you use ranked choice voting with 4 candidates. In Idaho, it would be 5. But for the voter, the RCV part is just in the general election. It's essentially choosing among 4 candidates or 5. In Nevada, they've sort of seen what they did in the primary. And I think it'll be something that voters handle quite well. That has a bigger impact on elections overall, right? Because you're shaking up the primary dynamics. And I think it's poked the bear in Colorado and Nevada and did with Republicans in Alaska, because parties that are feeling pretty good about being able to win tons of races in low turnout, separated primaries, and then coast and not have to do anything in the general election. That's kind of cool. And this means you are going to have more competition. I'm okay with that. Lee and I both really like proportional representation. That's going to be more competition too. And like giving voters more competition, more options, I think is a good thing. I think there's things we can add into these systems, like New York City has small donor public financing, 8-to-1 generous match, and really had some very exciting impact down ballot and some other races in New York when they went to RCV. So I think there's ways we can complement these reforms, but it really does change incentives. Just briefly, if I have more time, Nathan, I actually haven't been keeping good track, but do I have a little more time?
Yeah, you have about 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So people know that Mary Peltola beat Sarah Palin. Part of that was Sarah Palin had a real low ceiling of support, so she's a classic person who would have won a Republican primary, maybe in a 2-person race, kind of like bashed the heck out of Peltola. It had a mix of candidates, and Peltola has really emerged, at least for now, as the most popular politician in the state, and didn't have to run a single negative campaign while winning while winning both a special election and a general election. Really interesting person, and has been a pretty centrist representative from a state that has a lot of independent, sort of non ideological sort of partisan people. It's kind of an interesting state for the system. The state Senate, kind of with some of these new incentives of the general election electorate mattering more, 17 of the 20 state senators joined together in a bipartisan coalition to run the chamber, and that could happen in the House as well. So some interesting things happening there. Lisa Murkowski was able to be reelected in a way that she wouldn't have been almost certainly in a traditional system. Briefly, I want to say there are concerns about this. We'll hear about the voter confusion. I think I've addressed that, at least touched on it. We can go back and forth on that. I think some money and politics issues. I think let's build on changes rather than not do them, because voters might matter more. I don't think parties have to get weaker with these kinds of systems. That's sort of the assumption, like, oh my gosh, we're taking away their primary. Keep in mind that, like, all of these states voting on this, none of them have partisan elections and city elections, but parties are there. Parties are active. Parties can be active in the system. They are active in the system in Alaska. That's good. Like, that's what they should do. I would add to it that ability to show their preferences on the ballot, but regardless, they are active participants, as they are in local elections across all these states. And I think that we're not sort of removing that power. We also really should give
10 minutes
okay.
now, so just last sentence.
Oh, okay. So can I just say,
yeah,
maybe 4 sentences? Okay. So one, let's make sure as we look at this, and I know Lee kind of summarized the research, I think we need to give these things more time. He and I could talk about why Maine hasn't had more third-party activity, but the basic thing is they have terrible ballot access laws. We've also had a lot of leaping to big conclusions based on like a couple uses in cities. Not all uses are the same. And fundamentally, nothing is perfect in this world. No voting method is perfect. No approach is perfect. But I think we have a lot of arguments to be made that ranked choice voting is better. And I certainly would vote yes across all these states.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Rob. And I will do better about putting warnings in the chat for Lee as we get to a minute or 2 minutes and a minute. That sounds good. Lee, are you ready? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll start a timer on my computer. Well, thank you for hosting this debate, and delighted to be in conversation with Rob, who I admire tremendously and have learned so much from over the years, and is just a tremendous leader and visionary in the field of electoral reform. And someday, when we finally get proportional representation, Rob will deserve a lot of credit for being the true founder of a movement that has really grown tremendously. So I think Rob and I agree on an awful lot. We both agree that there are some real fundamental structural problems in our democracy, and electoral reform is the path forward. We both want a democracy that is more competitive, more representative, more pluralist, more fluid, more dynamic, and able to solve the big problems that our democracy is just not solving. Now, I think where we disagree a little bit is on the path to get there. And specifically, we're debating these different ballot initiatives. I'll focus here largely on Prop 131 in Colorado and the similar propositions around the country, because I thought that was what we were mostly debating. So I just want to talk a little bit about how I've come, and I oppose it. But I want to talk a little bit about how I've reluctantly come to this conclusion, because as Rob knows, and as you mentioned, Nathan, when I first heard about ranked choice voting, I said, "Oh, this is a great idea." Like, intuitively, it made a lot of sense. It seemed exciting, especially at a moment in which there was so much darkness in our politics. 2016, and I said, "Well, here's one bright spot." And at the time, there wasn't a ton of research on ranked choice voting. There was some evidence from Australia, which had used it for 100 years. And so I said, all right, well, this is exciting, makes sense. I understand why I think it should work. So let's do it. It could shake up the system a little bit, create some room for new types of candidates, maybe even new parties. And time again, there wasn't a lot of research. And so at New America, we pulled together a big research project. We supported 16 projects, academics, lots of studies as part of this electoral reform research group. And as the studies kept coming in, they kept finding, oh, there's no real effect of ranked choice voting, or maybe it's more confusing than we initially thought. Maybe voters don't really like it as much as some surveys had suggested. And this was troubling for me because it contradicted a lot of my priors. I thought this is a reform that's going to have some real important effects, and the studies that were coming in said, maybe not. And those studies have continued to come in. I have been collecting them. I went through my Zotero library this morning and found that I had now collected 65 academic studies testing the effects of ranked choice voting, which is just an explosion. And as articles keep coming out, some suggest some small positive results, some suggest some small negative results. I would say the majority are pretty much, doesn't really make much of a difference one way or the other. So at this point, my conclusion on ranked choice voting is ranked choice voting, qua ranked choice voting, is I'm kind of ambivalent on it. I see some positive benefits to it. I see some negatives. Mostly, I think doesn't make a whole lot of difference. There are circumstances where I think it adds it solves a clear problem. Rob mentioned crowded primaries. I think that is a good use for it. I think nonpartisan local elections where you have crowded fields, ranked choice voting clearly solves that problem. It solves the problem of plurality winners. And, I mean, I think if the main problem in American democracy right now were that we had a lot of 40% plurality winners and a lot of split vote problems, then RCV would clearly be the solution. But, I think given the level of partisan polarization, two-party partisan polarization, the dominance of one-party dominant elections in most of our elections, I think ranked choice voting doesn't make a whole lot of difference there. Now, I can certainly see a case for why ranked choice voting, qua ranked choice voting, would maybe bring in some more choice, and maybe that's worth the slight rise in voter confusion. As Rob said at the beginning, all systems, have trade-offs. There's no perfect voting system, and I think we should be honest that. So, I mean, some of that is a question of what we value most in electoral system. Rob mentioned the problems with mail-in ballots. Do we value convenience more or votes being counted. Now, when we come to the Colorado and the Alaska and the others, now we're adding something different. And this is something else that I've really come to understand as my thinking has evolved, which is the fundamental importance of political parties in modern representative democracy. The U.S. parties are weak. The U.S. parties are hollow. The U.S. parties are problematic. This is because many reasons. There are too few of them. They're stretched too big, but also they have no control over who represents their parties. So the way Colorado 131 and the other reforms are designed is they don't give parties any control. Now, I agree with Rob. I would love if we're doing this over, we should give parties control of their nominations. We should let parties decide who gets the party endorsement. But that's not how ballot 131 or any of these current ballots are designed. And you can see the flaws with this. In Alaska, the Republicans have figured out after one election, they figured out how to circumvent this. In the congressional election that Peltola is unfortunately probably going to lose, that Republicans coordinated so anybody who wasn't the top Republican finisher dropped out. So that kind of defeats the purpose of this reform if Republicans are basically coordinating around it anyway. And the effect of that is that the sixth place finisher, a guy named Eric Hafner, who claims to be a Democrat, runs on the Democrat line, or claims to be a Democrat. Democrats say, we don't want him because he is in federal prison in New York. But Democrats have no control over that. So here he is on the ballot. Now, that's a fix. We could design the system better to prevent that from happening, but that's not what the system is doing. So, I mean, I think that what I come down to, when I think about these reforms is, what is the problem that this particular reform is solving? Now, again, all pros and cons to all these reforms, but what I see, particularly in Colorado reform and these other all-comer primary plus RCV reforms, is a system that makes parties even less relevant in selecting candidates, and that further weakens political parties in the U.S. And my view is we ought to have more parties and we ought to have better parties. And the way to get better parties is to have more of them and more competition and more parties organizing and competing for voters. And what this reform is really just opening up to any candidate who wants to claim to be a member of any party and could be running from prison out of state and claim to be a party member, and here they are on the ballot. So I'd like to see reforms that actually make stronger, healthier, and more parties. I mean that this Colorado 131 and the other, ballot initiatives, I have mixed feelings on them. I see some benefit, and certainly some of the things that Rob talks about, more choice, more candidates running, potentially more competition. But then when I look at the evidence and see what's happened, in places that have opened up primaries, that have implemented ranked choice voting reforms, I see pretty meh results, and I see some real trade-offs of voter confusion. So, on balance, you know, I think that if I were registered in Colorado, I would be voting against 131, and I will probably vote against the DC initiative as well because it also opens up primaries.
Thank you, Lee. Rob, 5 minutes to respond.
Yeah, I think Lee and I do have a lot in common that I hope we can keep building on. Let me just go quickly through some of my quick notes here. So on research, my frustration with a lot of scholarly research, maybe there's some researchers on here, is I think there are incentives to pick at flaws rather than sort of sometimes look at the very big elephant of positives. And I'll give one example. And so I would say a lot of these studies I think are not looking at what I would look at and what voters look at and what actually elected officials look at, effect on candidate behavior that actually changes incentives for what they do. Reasons to vote, how many more votes count in one round versus another, which is just extraordinarily more. Like that's a huge thing. And I don't know, I don't think any academic has studied it because it's maybe not interesting enough, or it doesn't have the academic incentive to sort of say a positive. But like there was a critique of Santa Fe, like academics like picking up on a fact that, wow, 15% of Latino voters found it some confusing. That didn't mean that they didn't rank right. And actually 99.9% of voters in that 5-candidate race that had just been established RCV with sort of a 2-month runway cast about more than 60% ranked all 5 candidates for mayor. The overall overwhelming percentages of all groupings of voters were positive about the change. And yet this sort of critique of it like left an impression of negativity. And that's sort of like this ongoing frustration that I can have, and there's a longer topic there. I think looking quick, with sad that Lee would vote against DC because it allows unaffiliated voters to vote in a primary. We're talking about 15% of voters, a lot of whom are automatically registered as unaffiliated. I don't know. That doesn't seem like a great reason to oppose a system that, say, the Ward 7 city primary was one with 23% this year. That would allow PR, Lee, in the 2 at-large seats to the extent that you can do it in a 2-seat race. But I would say, as a general matter about Alaska, is that if you look at what has happened in Alaska, I think it has created a real difference. You look at what the state Senate is doing and the rewards they're getting for working together and having actually sort of objective views, as the state Senate is doing a lot of good things in Alaska, and it's because they can take their case to the general election electorate. The Senate's president, before she got elected in top 4, had actually lost as Senate president a separate primary. Then she was able to get back in the Senate president again, and needs that system to be able to govern that way. I think on a pathway to reform, that we have a really interesting conversation about what the U.S. Way to win reform is, what we can ultimately win here. We have a political culture that has sort of expectations of the parties actually not being homogeneous, but having some real differences within them. In some ways, when our country has sort of governed most effectively, it has been when there have been sort of differences within the party. And so I'm a big fan of the single transferable vote, the proportional form of RCV, used in primaries, used in general elections, to kind of allow a flourishing of sort of factions within parties, but a cohesion around the major parties, so they're kind of truly become big tents. Versus, can we impose a kind of a European style 6-candidate, 6-party system? Can we get people to buy into that? Do we want to have legislators sort of voting robotically based on what their party leaders have negotiated. I think a lot of people don't want that. And so I think we have to decide how that could be won. And keeping in mind, 70% of cities use nonpartisan elections. And if we're going to get like changes and models at that level, it's generally going to be within that environment, which is why I think proportional RCV is the way to go. So that's a longer form conversation. But I think that just as a final point, oh, actually on Alaska, yeah, thanks, Nathan. We can have weird guys like this guy, Eric Hafner, has run in 2 other states. Okay, that's a weird part of our system that you can do that. But they got ranked choice voting. Big deal. The guy's going to get like 1.5% of the vote, whatever it is. And almost all of those people are going to rank probably Mary Peltola second. And the fact that this system allows people like that to get to the general election ballot is the same. It will also allow libertarians and Greens and some other people that sort of jump in the race because he got to advance with a very small percentage, which is partly the thing. It doesn't actually keep small parties out as long as they run and compete and start making use of the system. Finally, let's make some really interesting uses of ranked choice voting in Oregon. Let's win it. And then I think like the Oregon Workers Families Party has endorsed it. They can work fusion and RCV and actually kind of do some really creative work to, I think, show that those reforms work well together. And it's just a basic point is things can work well together.
Thank you. Finally, Lee's response.
All right. Well, I'll respond to what Rob said here. So there's first question about the academic studies. And I'm a PhD in political science, so I understand the academy's skepticism towards any reform and a sort of contrarian stance to poke holes in everything. And so I certainly agree that there is an emphasis on that in some academic studies. On the other hand, I think that's important to understand what the weaknesses are with any system. And then, we have a debate about the pros versus the cons. And I mean, certainly this is something that keeps showing up in academic studies, is that lower income communities tend to find RCV more confusing, tend to make errors, tend to get their ballots miscounted at higher rates. Now, we can argue whether that's something that's a cost, but the benefits outweigh the costs. And that's a reasonable argument to have. But on balance, the studies do find that, and it's not just one study; it's study after study after study, and so. Certainly, in the in the research that I was involved in New America, this whole suite of research proposals, I went into it thinking that the research was going to show that RCV had some significant benefits, and I was surprised, and it was that and other stuff that changed my view. And I think academics have looked at this from a lot of different perspectives, and there's some evidence. And again, I mean, I think it's important to say that some RCV has strengths, and in certain types of elections, those strengths may be more apparent than in other types of elections. And I agree with what Rob said, that the trajectory is long and it takes a few cycles, which is why I think the research coming out now is even more important. On Alaska, we have one 2-year period that a lot of people have studied, a lot of people have drawn conclusions from. I think a few things to note about Alaska. One is that the state has had a long history of bipartisan governing coalitions in both the House and the Senate in the state legislature. So in many ways, this is just what has happened in the last election is largely a continuation of what has happened in the past. And Alaska has a very unique and distinct political culture. It is by far the state with the highest number of of independents. It's kind of a sui generis political culture, very small state, and state senate has only 20 members, smallest state senate in the country. So I think we should be careful about over learning from any single 2-year period. And this is why I would say any study by itself, take it with a grain of salt. 65 studies collectively, that helps us to think about well, what do we really know, and we're continuing to learn. In terms of pathway, in terms of the role of political parties, again, this has been a long-standing debate that Rob and I have had. I think there was a period in which American parties were more factional, and that worked reasonably well, although it created a lot of confusion for voters. I think it would, given the nationalization of our politics and the diversity of our country, it would be better to have more political parties. And yes, political parties are never popular, even in countries with a lot of them. People don't like political parties in general. But I think it's really important for the health of democracy for people to feel that they have at least one political party that represents them, that they feel connected to. And this is a really crucial role of political parties, is that they connect people to government. They make people feel part of something, and factions, individual candidates can't do that in the way that political parties do that. So I think it's really important to put political parties and healthy political parties at the center of our reform efforts.
Excellent. Thank you for staying on time so beautifully. It was perfect.
All right, well, I had a timer going.
Good work. All right, we're going to turn over to questions. We've already got some coming in. Great discussion. There's a lot to talk about here. Steve, you were asking about what was being measured in the studies. Do you want to elaborate on that at all, or do you feel like that was answered by the discussion since you asked that?
There's all kinds of outcomes
There's
that are measured.
65 of them.
Yeah, it's hard to summarize. Some of it measures candidate entry, some of it measures voter turnout, some of it measures voter error, some of it measures the effect on policy outcomes. Some of it measures civility and campaigning style. So there's a lot of research questions here. And each study looks at a different set of elections and uses a different method. Some studies are better than others, as is always the case. Some of them are just frankly crap, and some of them are really well done.
All right.
Let me just put into chat the FairVote info, and it often, I feel very proud of the research work that the FairVote team does. Obviously, we are looking at this with a kind of an affirming lens that of its value, but we do take on the tough questions, and I think there's really quite a lot to look at there that has not been subject of studies, like what percentage of voters rank a winner in the top 3 in crowded fields. Like, I think that's actually super interesting for what it means for the engagement that happened and so on. My new colleague Evelyn Dowling's done a really good one on turnout, showing that there is this very positive impact on turnout that she's seen. So look at them all, but it's something that you're going to hear some more come about. I did want to actually, if I can, Nathan, because it relates to the last question about the sort of low-income voters and racial minorities. So just to put it in perspective, like when Lee was saying, yes, it shows that, but it shows it in these really small ways. Like there's a whole paper saying that in New York City, some of the more, heavier concentrations of racial minorities, the overvote rate was significantly more. Well, it was 99.6% valid versus 99 point, whatever it was, 8.5 or 8 or something like that, right? It's like, it's still almost all voters weren't making a mistake. It's relatively a little different, but it's not nearly the kind of numbers that I was like lifting up with, say, the vote by mail problems, right? Other things that can have a much, much bigger impact. And on the reverse side, it's not looking at how many more votes are counting, including those out of racial minority communities. And there's a lot of good data about, particularly where RCV has been used over time, about what is happening with people of color as candidates. Like in the Bay Area, there was a big jump in people of color over the first 10 years of the 4 cities that have used RCV for a while. And the big growth was almost all in white plurality, non-white majority districts, where not that it's so simplistically polarized that all non-white voters were voting for non-white candidates, but it depolarized elections and created opportunities where there was this big surge in that kind of area. That's really interesting. No one I've seen has studied that academically.
Evelyn, do you want to raise your question about impact on political parties?
Yeah, this is a great discussion. Hi there. My name's Evelyn Dowling. I'm a colleague of Rob's. Sorry for joining a little bit late. Yeah, I just wanted to I have a question for Lee. Would you say that RCV's impact on political parties depends on whether it's implemented alongside other reforms like multi-member districts or national popular vote or something along those lines? Does it depend on, right, these other reforms?
Yeah, so if you implemented RCV with multi-member district, which is the single transferable vote, that would probably create space for more political parties. Depends on district magnitude. The larger the district magnitude. So if you had a 3-member district, maybe not. If you moved to a 5 or 7-member district, probably yes. And then some of that would also depend on ballot design. So there are 2 versions of STV. There's the Australian version of STV, which just lists candidates in alphabetical order, which doesn't group them by party. And then there's the Australian version of STV, which does group candidates by party and also allows voters to rank the parties in order. And so that functions more like a list proportional system with some ranking, which actually I think would be a good combination of RCV and open list, which is the type of proportional representation that I would prefer, particularly that Australia has made a number of changes over the years to make that STV ballot more voter friendly. In earlier versions of it, there was a lot of voter confusion and a lot of flawed ballots. And over the years, they've made it more, as they've grouped it by party more, voters have found it a lot easier to use. And most voters, like 95% of Australian voters, vote what they call above the line, which is they just vote for the party, which suggests that people like the convenience of just voting for parties when they have that opportunity.
Great.
There's some.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll just add very briefly that
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It's sort of on my mind this year as everyone focuses on only 7 states and 43 states are essentially out of play. We don't have to have that system. National Popular Vote is a state-based reform effort that I've been involved in over the last 20 years that could get another win in Michigan and actually be that much closer. We're really not that far away from it having enough electoral votes to kick in before 2028. So some people said, well, how would RCV work with that? And Maine is part of the compact. Alaska has ranked choice voting for president as well. They just would run RCV down to their usual whoever has won the state, and then that would be reported out. There are ways to go further, and there's sort of fun proposals. I did a long academic article on that, but I think it also speaks to the fact that we're going to see some other changes. I sure hope so, that create the recognition that we are able to change things. And when we've seen changes in this country, they've generally come in clusters. And I think it's when people realize, oh, we can actually do stuff. And it usually comes after kind of challenging times. And we're certainly in that too. So this is a really exciting time for all these conversations because I think change is coming.
All right, great. We have a lot of good questions coming in. There's one from Neta Dow Academy that they can't speak up, but I'll read the questions. Does RCV presuppose orthogonal options? If my top ranked choice is eliminated, is it fair or accurate to assume that my other selections are unchanged? This seems more pressing when the level of education or awareness about different options may be uneven. And also a question that about whether more parties equals stronger parties. Are these separate issues? So can you and this is for Lee, say a bit about the relationship between more and stronger parties?
Well,
And
so I
both of
mean,
you.
my view is yes, that more parties and stronger parties do go together. I think it's given the vast expanse of this country and the pluralism and diversity, the two parties, although they are more homogenous internally than they've ever been, still cast a quite wide tent, which makes it hard for them to be strong in addition to they just have no control over who their nominees are. So I think if you had more parties, the parties would be a little smaller and they would be healthier because they would not be trying to be so many things to so many different people, and they could focus on a more core set of concerns and link voters to their government more effectively. Also, competition strengthens parties, and if you had a proportional system with multiple parties competing in lots of different places, you would naturally strengthen the parties. I mean, you look at a state like Wisconsin. Wisconsin Democratic Party is a strong party. It's a strong party because Wisconsin is a 50-50 state. And so there's a lot of reasons for the party to raise support to actually be a strong and vibrant party, as opposed to in most places where the parties are, entirely empty and hollow because there's no real competition. So when your votes, when every vote matters, as it does under a proportional system, parties are just going to invest more. I mean, there's a larger conversation about the failure of political parties more broadly, and I think they do need to adapt. I mean, and I saw another question in the chat about whether first past the post precludes multiple parties. I mean, not necessarily. You could look at the UK, which has first past the post, and there are, some smaller parties that are gaining. Canada, which is first past the post, and smaller parties gaining. Although that makes the distortions of first past the post even more apparent, as the last UK election, Labour won a third of the votes and got 2/3 of the seats. So. I think it's possible you could start seeing some local parties running in different parts of the country. Look at Nebraska, where Dan Osborne is running as an independent, and there's no Democrat. I think we should see more Osborne style candidacies. I think they might develop into some local parties, but also if you had fusion voting with first past the post voting, that also strengthens multiple parties. I'll let Rob take the question about preferences within RCV. That was the first question.
And that was, can you clarify the preferences within I missed the prompt. Nathan, do you have the?
Yeah, it says, does RCV presuppose orthogonal options? If my top ranked choice is eliminated, is it fair or accurate to assume that my other selections are unchanged?
I think so. I mean, it's one thing I'll just sort of say. There are tons, I mean, literally thousands of NGOs and political parties that use ranked choice voting by their own volition for their leadership elections, organizational elections. All 5 Canadian parties do it. They're not using other funky variations of ranked choice voting. They could, but they don't, because I think this is a pretty tested, psychologically sensible way of thinking about voting, which is if your candidate is in last place, then you're out. And that's sort of the Republican Party, when they were picking their speaker and finding their candidate for it, they were voting. They didn't use RCV, but they always knocked the last person out until they got down to Mike Johnson or whomever it was. There's a certain logic to that, and I think it works. And voters are used to it, so I'm not really worried about spending a lot of time on variations. Let me just say quickly about this sort of question about party building and so on. One thing we have to factor in, we're the only state that really invests in government spending on primaries and holding primaries. If you follow the Iowa caucuses in 2020, people aren't really anxious to kind of turn the keys over to parties to pick their nominees. And I think that's going to be a whole conversation as we create architecture for reform. But when you do that, they're sort of inherently lose some control of at least party bosses or something, picking their nominees or kind of organizing who wins nominations. And so the Fair Representation Act contemplates ranked choice voting in the primary proportional style as well as the general, and that was modeled by the cumulative voting system they used to have in Illinois from 1870, 1980 in 3-member districts, and created some really interesting variations or factions within the parties, but also this virtue of both parties winning everywhere and both parties being able to have incentives to build and grow themselves everywhere. So if you just think of having stronger major parties, that's kind of, they're getting really weak in certain places. And then the last thing I'll just say about parties is that we and there's question, someone was saying like, yeah, I think the ranked choice voting ballot in a multi-STV system would allow the emergence of minor parties, but they have a long way to go. we can like turn the keys and say, oh yeah, suddenly the Libertarian Party is just like totally ready to have candidates win 20% of the vote and be part of our representational system. There's a lot of from here to there kind of work that I think changes can create opportunities to do there. But our parties are complex is an easy way to say it, in the sense that a lot of elected officials from the parties kind of look down on their party activists. And there's some pretty wild party activists. And like even in Idaho, where we're doing this campaign, the Idaho party is kind of a little different than a lot of the Idaho elected officials. And it's just something that we just have to recognize that they're not the same thing.
Right, thank you. Last question real quick, if we could keep the question and the response as brief as possible so we stay on time. But Mika, who helped put this together, could you wrap us up with a question?
Well, sure, very quickly, and I put it in the chat. If they could just address how a blanket primary plus RCV, which is what 131 is, affects the chances of wealthy or well-financed candidates versus those with less money.
I'll just address this, which is that point I made during the talk, which is that we should, I think, explore things, and Colorado will have to do this because any implementation statute in Colorado has to go through the legislature, because they did this kind of midnight sneaky bill that kind of makes it hard to implement it without further action of the legislature. But I think in a kind of a pro-democracy, like the solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy, I would like to see them explore that, because it's the fundamental.
But Rob, you're not answering my question.
Well, here,
Does it help?
Mika, I'm starting to answer
without
it.
all the other things you need to do. Just, does this make it easier for rich people to win elections or harder?
For rich people to win elections, or
yeah. On balance,
I think like the Alaska evidence is very uncertain as to what it did for the role of money on outcomes. So we have more to learn. But I think that this, if the case is based on the fact that their voters have more agency and more voters are part of choosing, I think that's a good thing. If that means more money is needed, that doesn't necessarily mean more money wins. And that's something we've really seen in RCV elections, that more money doesn't necessarily win. You see real value in other things.
New York City, where I'm from, is sort of a counterexample. But okay,
I would say not Mika. So we should offline work that out, because I think that's actually not true about New York City.
I'll just say as a general matter that when parties are weaker, outside groups are more important, and the money that flows through outside groups and outside donors becomes more important. And certainly money became a lot more important to who wins in California when California moved to a top two system, and there have been a number of papers on that topic. So I think, parties have their problems, but at least they can sort of meld together a bunch of different interests when you have candidates who come and go and can often rely on the donations of one or a few particularly wealthy people. I think that creates some problems in political accountability that parties can help solve a little bit.
Well, thank you. That's a really important topic to end on, because it really highlights some of the stakes at play here. Thank you both, Rob and Lee, for taking up this challenge of this debate. This has been really insightful. And thank you all for bringing your questions and for being part of this discussion. We'll share the recording out, share it with your friends, and for those of you who are making decisions about this in the coming weeks or in the coming week, I hope this was informative for the rest of us. I hope this can inform our ongoing work in the study and development of more accountable democratic systems. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day or night, wherever you are.
Thanks all.
Thank you.